Fantastic. Okay, once again, very good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for joining this afternoon's Business Environment Lecture number 4. Today we are going to be looking at the global context and understanding how trade policies impact the business environment for organisations. Most of the examples are UK-based, but each country within the Western Hemisphere will have their own policies that are vaguely similar. Some countries pursue more open global trade policies, others are more closed off, but I will try to make reference to that as we go through today's session. Just a reminder of where we're at in the series. So the final lecture of the 4 series lectures on business environment. Lecture number 1, we looked at what is a business. We defined the business environment. We looked at business structures. We looked at public and private sector. We looked at primary, secondary, tertiary, and quaternary sectors. We looked at stakeholders. We looked at organizational design. So these are all elements of the first lecture. Lecture number 2, we touched on the economy and understanding the fundamentals, demand and supply, and how they impact decisions made by a business. Lecture number 3, we looked at fiscal and monetary policy and the role of the government in deciding or impacting how the economy may work. So again, what can the government do? How can the government influence certain proceedings when it comes to interest rates, inflation, etc., and how that may materialize when it comes to demand and supply and what a business may look to achieve. So that's where we've got to so far. And today we are now going to be looking at international trade policies. We're going to be understanding how businesses interact with one another on an international scale, how they import, export, and what are some of the policies that govern or that rule how international trade is conducted. Okay, so final series of lectures and business environment. And as I was saying at the very start of the session, after this lesson, you should have accumulated enough knowledge and insights to be able to put together your assessment, which is a portfolio of evidence. Okay. Good. Right. What are we doing today? So today's session, we want you to develop an understanding of capitalism, globalization, and internationalization. So capitalism, very much the American way, the American dream, for those of you that are familiar, is all about you go to America, you work hard, and you can succeed. Okay, so capitalism is about each man for themselves, each man or woman for themselves, and you can achieve success if you work hard. Globalization speaks for itself, all about internationalization and growing your business beyond just the domestic borders of your country. We'll also look at advantages and disadvantages of each form, all 3 of capitalism, globalization, and internationalization. We will generate critical thinking to recognize some of the kind of ethical principles around international expansion. So this is becoming more and more important in business nowadays. We're looking at how businesses can be more sustainable, more ethical, more moral in their decision making. So we'll touch a little bit around those principles. And finally, we will discuss the internationalization process that companies must follow to create new business opportunities. So again, how can internationalization lead to better business opportunities? And that very much is what today is all about. So let's start off by looking at capitalism. So firstly, let's define capitalism. So essentially, it's an economic system that combines private ownership of productive enterprises with competition between them in the pursuit of profit. So very much what you would probably recognize in most corporations today. I mean, they're all run by private owners, whether that be shareholders, whether that be small businesses owned by 1 or 2 directors. So, capitalism is all about how private ownership encourages competition and how that competition is what pushes organizations to want to make more profit. And it basically advocates the restriction of governmental intervention in the economy. So what do you mean by that? Well, the idea is the market will dictate itself. There's no need for government to be directly involved. We don't want it to be a planned market, okay? We don't want the government to have a heavy role. Unfortunately, in some countries that still applies. For example, North Korea. North Korea, everything is dictated by the North Korean regime. They decide what products are made available. They decide how much of goods to buy. They decide what people can and can't consume. in terms of what's available in the market. So that's where government's heavily involved. But in most Western or developed countries, you will find capitalism or a form of capitalism where private enterprises are mostly responsible for the provision of goods and services, and the government plays a hands-off role. That's not to say the government is not involved. For example, in the UK, the government have a series of what we call ombudsmen. So, for example, the Ofcom, when it comes to television and communications and media, Ofcom are there to make sure that the media doesn't exploit customers, doesn't exploit people when it comes to reporting. We have Ofgem, which are all about energy sector, making sure that energy companies aren't exploiting customers. So the government do play a role. However, with capitalism, private companies are responsible for driving the enterprise. All the government does is make sure that companies are being fair in their approach. They're not intentionally trying to manipulate the market. They're not intentionally trying to raise prices so that nobody can afford them. Okay, so it's about making sure that the economy is running, is making sure that the poor and the rich are all being catered for. The idea behind capitalism, or the supposed idea, is all about increasing wealth. Okay, so in a capitalist country, if you're a business owner and you're willing to work hard, you're willing to put in long hours, the chances are you will be able to succeed. Okay, so capitalist economies encourage businesses to want to drive further, to want to get bigger, to want to expand. It's all about growing your business enterprise. However, it's unable to ensure equitable distribution of resources. So a solely capitalist country with no government intervention at all would probably be suitable to rich, or people that are wealthy, or people that are better off. The working class, or people that perhaps don't have as many financial resources, would struggle in a capitalist country, because it's all about the survival of the fittest. Okay, those that have the resources, those that are able to compete, tend to be the ones that are able to survive in a capitalist economy. Those that don't, unfortunately, tend to fall by the wayside. And again, that's another reason why in most Western and developed countries, there is some form of government involvement. Not to the same degree as North Korea, for example, but certainly some form of government involvement to make sure that the poor aren't being left behind, to make sure that businesses are also considering the needs of people that perhaps aren't able to afford expensive or luxurious products. There is here a quote that if globalization amounts to the global spread of capitalism, then this will result in increased global inequality. So whilst capitalism can be good to encourage business growth and to encourage businesses to be competitive, there is recognition that if capitalism was the driving force behind globalization or internationalization, then we might actually have an issue, because you would end up with higher levels of global inequality, which is something that's becoming more and more important in all countries. The idea that inequality, yes, it still exists, and no, it should be getting smaller, but it isn't. Governments are trying to find ways to tackle that social inequality, to tackle ways in which people from disadvantaged or poorer backgrounds are able to gain a little bit of a foothold and try to emerge from their situation. So capitalism, all about rich getting richer almost. If you put in the hard work, if you have the money, if you have the resources, you can succeed. But it's all about competition. You're competing against one another. You're trying to beat your competition to become better yourself. What about globalization then? So globalization refers to the growing integration of economies, societies over the past 2 decades that have been made possible by rapid advances in communication technology. So a few things there that I want to pick up on. Firstly, it's about the integration of economies and societies. What do you mean by that? Well, it's about recognizing that the economy isn't just what's in your domestic market. You know, if you live in France, Germany, Italy, if you live in India, you live in China, you live in South Africa, you live in the USA, there's no such thing as having just a domestic market anymore. In today's day and age, any customer anywhere in the world, within reason, has access to a global market. You don't have to rely on products from your own country. You can get goods and services from across the world. Okay, so globalization is that drive towards better opportunities, better access to goods and services. And how is that made possible? Well, the rapid advancement of IT. So if it wasn't for the advancement in the internet, if it wasn't for the access to Wi-Fi, to 5G network, 4G network, depending on where you are in the world, if it wasn't for laptops and smartphones, the world wouldn't be as connected. These technologies have made the world more of a connected place. You can now talk to family members across the globe using FaceTime, using video calls. You know, it's almost as if they're sitting in front of you. You can connect to people anywhere in the world as long as they have an internet connection. You can buy products through sites such as Amazon, eBay, Alibaba. Sorry, someone's not in mute. Can I just ask everyone to make sure they're in mute, please? It just stops. It just stops people from being disturbed. Perfect, thank you. So yes, nowadays, as a result of the advances in technology, people anywhere in the world are able to communicate with one another, irrespective of where they may be and the differences in time, etc., etc. So globalization has been made possible as a result of international borders being broken down through IT. Okay. Traveling hasn't got easier. I mean, traveling is still the same. It still takes 24 hours to fly to Australia, but you can now pick up the phone and speak to someone in Australia. You can buy a product from a retailer in Australia and have it delivered to you. You don't necessarily have to rely on traveling to those countries to buy goods and services from them. It is claimed that it's created a smaller world in which ideas and money can move across borders almost instantly. So again, the world all of a sudden has become a lot smaller. Why do we say that? Because all of a sudden you're able to access goods, services from across the globe. You're able to access resources. You're able to access whatever you may be looking for. An example of that being, if you take some of the large banks, what they did at the start of the 21st century was they outsourced a lot of their customer service function. So whenever you called customer service for a large banking corporation, you ended up going through to a customer service center, maybe in China, India, maybe in one of the kind of Middle Eastern countries, not necessarily Far Eastern countries. So the idea was cheap labor, easy to do, easy to implement. So although you were calling your local bank or you were calling your local financial institution, you ended up being connected to people on a global scale. Okay, so the idea here being that no longer are you restricted to having to fly to a country or having to wait until you can travel to do something. You can now do it over the internet. You can now do it via video calls. You can interact. You can be involved. You can buy products and services at the click of a button. Okay, so IT has very much been a driver in making the world smaller. Similarly, previously, to transfer money abroad, it required you having to go to the bank, having to arrange transfers. Banks would speak to one another. It would take at least 2 to 3 days to make an international payment. Nowadays, you can make an international payment at the click of a button on your mobile phone. Okay, so the world has become a lot easier, a lot less restrictive when it comes to international exchanges, international trades, international mobility. Here is a quote from George Soros. He says that the free movement of capital and the increasing domination of national economies by the global financial markets and multinational corporations. So the idea here being that the big multinational companies, the likes of Apple, Samsung, Coca-Cola, Nestle, you know, these are the big corporations that have a footprint all over the globe pretty much. No matter what country you live in, you will have heard of Apple, you will have heard of Samsung, you will have heard of Coca-Cola, the brand, Nestle, Pepsi. You know, these are all big brands that operate on a global scale, and they're very much driving what we call the globalization movement. They're standardizing products across the globe. Yes, there will be some differences. There's some products that are only sold in certain markets. For example, McDonald's have a vegetarian-only restaurant in India. So in Amritsar, you're not allowed to sell meat within 1 mile kilometre of the Golden Temple, because it's a holy city, and Indian Sikh community see meat as being against their faith. So that McDonald's sells only vegetarian products. Now again, can you imagine going to your local McDonald's and there being no Big Mac, no chicken sandwich, no the recent one they've come out with in the UK is the McSpicy. So imagine going to imagine going to McDonald's and seeing that there's no meat on the menu. It's almost unbelievable. where we live in the world. However, in certain parts of the world, because of the way in which that economy works, because of the way in which culture works, it fits. Okay, so these organizations, these big corporates, are able to drive almost a form of standardization. People recognize the brand, people recognize the name, and they're helping contribute to what we call the move towards globalization. Another quote here from Malcolm Waters. He says that social process in which the constraints of geography on social and cultural arrangements recede. So again, previously, geography was all about traveling, okay? How long does it take for you to travel there to do business? All of a sudden, you no longer have to travel there. You can just pick up your phone, switch on your laptop, and you can trade with a country anywhere in the world. It's also about the culture. Again, previously, cultures were very, very fixed. You know, the UK had a different culture to somewhere in South America, in Asia, in Australia. They still have different cultures. However, the cultural embeddedness has increased. Why is it increased? Because we all have standardized products. We have standardized ways in which we live our life. The rich people in countries that are still developing have a very vaguely similar lifestyle to most people here in the developed world. Unfortunately, there are still people that live in poverty in some countries, or below the poverty line. Yes, their world is very different, but in general, the idea here being that globalization is pushing global standards. It's making things more equal in terms of access to products, in terms of access to goods and services. And it's also about the ways in which people are becoming increasingly aware. So globalization is not just about it happening, it's about our awareness of it happening. So again, the fact that McDonald's exists in almost every country in the world pretty much, it's a big deal. But if you don't know that, then does it really matter? However, now that you know that, whenever you travel to another country, you can look out for McDonald's, you can look out for a KFC, a Burger King, a Pizza Hut. These are all brands that are fairly synchronized. They all have vaguely similar products. They all have a standard of service. They all have a standard of operational excellence that you would expect when you shop there. Okay, so these brands, these retailers, these corporate companies that offer products and services, they're helping drive globalization. They're helping drive the idea that things can be standardized. Not completely, you know, if you take what is available here in the UK, you might not get everything in, for example, China, but you will get a lot of the similar products. You will be able to access an equivalent product, perhaps by the same brand even, in a country that's so many 100,000 miles away. So again, here's an example for you. So the Starbucks concept. With Starbucks, you've got, you know, different places where Starbucks source their stuff from. So the coffee bean tends to come from South America. It also comes from Far East Asia. That's where they tend to get their coffee beans from. The paper that goes into the Starbucks cups, that tends to come from mostly Europe, Scandinavian countries, Sweden, Denmark, Finland, Norway. They provide the paper that goes into your Starbucks coffee cup. The sugar tends to come from both South America and Australia. And again, that's what makes a Starbucks coffee. Okay, so when you buy a Starbucks coffee, you're actually buying something that might come from, for example, Far East Asia. The coffee bean comes from Far East Asia. The cup itself might be made from Norwegian or Swedish paper. And the sugar may have come from South America, Argentina or Brazil, have provided the sugar for your coffee. Okay, so very much the idea here that globalization isn't just about global brands, it's also about global sourcing of raw materials. No longer do you need to rely on your internal market for the raw materials. You can look externally. So if you're a business operating in a global environment, you have access to global resources, you have access to global capital, global labor. You're able to utilize those facilities and those options. Okay. Again, on the right hand side, you have McDonald's and the idea that the fries from McDonald's, where do the potatoes come from? So again, as you can see, The bulk of the potatoes come from North America and Europe. That's mostly because that's where a lot of McDonald's stores are. But you've got potatoes coming from South America, you have potatoes coming from South Africa, you have potatoes from the Far East, you've got India there, you've got the Middle East, you've got Australia, Indonesia, Russia as well to an extent. So it just goes to show how the influence of McDonald's has grown in those countries. And again, the figure at the bottom showing how much sales they make. Easily, McDonald's is the biggest fast food franchise. I think this was designed in 2004 or 5, and back then McDonald's made up $41 billion worth of sales. Okay, so if you compare the amount of money that McDonald's made to the GDP of a country like Afghanistan in 2004, Afghanistan had a GDP of $21 billion. McDonald's doubled the gross domestic product of a country. That's how big the brand of McDonald's is. Okay. So there is something that's called the Mcdonaldization. Because McDonald's have been so successful at doing what they do, scholars or researchers have been trying to understand, well, how have they done it? What have they done that's made them so successful? So there's a model that's called the Mcdonaldization, and it's basically made up of 5 principles. Number 1, it's all about being efficient. If anyone's ever been or seen the inside of a McDonald's restaurant, especially behind the counters, behind the tills, when it comes to the machinery, when it comes to the way in which the production line works, McDonald's is very much structured around being efficient. Okay, things are timed in a McDonald's restaurant. They actually time people doing their jobs because they want to improve how quickly. They really want to put the fast back into fast food. They want to make sure that everyone's acting in an efficient way. Even the way in which customers order, they have a very specific structure. Nowadays, it's all about using a touch screen to place your order. You don't even speak to anyone. You can walk into a McDonald's restaurant, you have the touch screen, you place your order, print the receipt, you go to the collection point, and your food will be presented to you, and then you walk away. So again, it's all about increasing efficiency. How can you make things faster? How can you make things better? Calculability. So what do you mean by calculability? Well, that's all about looking at the quantity and the speed, not necessarily the quality. Now, that's not to say that they can serve anything. You know, if McDonald's quality of food fell drastically, then I'm sure people will stop buying from them. People will stop consuming McDonald's food. But at the end of the day, their emphasis isn't on the best quality of meat or the best quality of salads or best quality of buns. They're all about quantity and speed. How many can they get out the door, and how quickly can they serve their customers? As I mentioned already, the various aspects of work are timed. The person who's flipping the burgers, he or she is being timed. The person that's putting the burger into the bun or the roll, they're being timed. The person that's cooking or frying the chips, they're also being timed. It's all about making sure that people are working effectively and efficiently to reduce any wastage. McDonald's also have an idea of predictability. So the idea is that what you're doing is standardized. There should be no surprise to anyone. Everything works in a process so that you become familiar, you become an expert, you become better and better. You can almost do it in your sleep. Okay, so the idea of predictability is quite important. And finally, control by means of technology. So again, McDonald's have a lot of technology that drives what they do. They have state-of-the-art almost technology that drives their restaurants, multi-million-pound investments, and the idea is that having the latest technology helps them become faster. It helps them offer a standard of food which customers cannot alter. So again, it's not about specialization. You can't really walk into a McDonald's and choose whatever you want. You have to choose from a fixed menu. Yes, you can maybe ask them not to put something in your burger, you know, if you don't want sauce, or if you don't want lettuce or something, sometimes they do that for you. But realistically, if you go into a McDonald's restaurant, you choose from a fixed menu. You don't really have the option or the ability to be able to personalize your meal. So if we ask the question, globalization, is it for good? I don't know. Let's open the floor. What do you guys think? Is globalization a force for good? Or is globalization an evil that's destroying individual cultures, that's destroying local and national ways of operating, ways of working. So I'll open the floor up to answer. I'll open the floor out for you to answer that question, okay? What do you think? Do you think globalization is a force for good, or do you think it's an evil? Any thoughts from anyone? Anyone? Feel free to come off mute and share your thoughts with me if you'd like to. No one got anything to say. Well, my opinion, based on my research, based on what people have said about globalization, I think it can be a force for good if it's managed properly. So it's about not killing individual cultures but celebrating them. It's about making sure that people can raise awareness of cultures and celebrate that they've got different cultures. Globalization has made it easy for people across the globe to take part in cultural events, to become aware of different cultures, to become aware of how different cultures affect people's behaviour. So it can be good. It can also allow companies to grow. It can help reduce poverty because it creates opportunities across the globe. If companies are growing, they're expanding, they're creating job opportunities in different countries, particularly developing countries. It's also encouraging brands to become more well known, well aware. It also improves communication. People can now communicate, they can talk to people across the world. It's also been helped by things like technology and the internet. It's allowed us to become a lot more connected. It's made the world a smaller place. It's about integrating different economies so that people are aware of different countries and different ways of working. However, there are still some concerns, particularly around safety. For example, terrorism. Some people argue that terrorism has become a lot easier because of IT, because of development of communication technologies. People sitting on the other side of the world can now plan atrocious attacks on different countries. So again, terrorism is something that is perhaps a negative of the globalization movement. The impact on the environment, because the world has become much smaller, because we're consuming more electricity, we're consuming perhaps more natural resources. What's the effect that we're having on the environment? What's the impact of this on equality or inequality? What's the impact on exploiting different countries? So again, we've heard lots of stories of clothing brands perhaps exploiting low-wage countries. Some of them are using child labour, not intentionally. They'll claim, but they are doing it. It's a practice that unfortunately is becoming more common with some brands. They're becoming more likely to engage in these types of activities. So there is concerns for how globalization might not always be a good thing. But again, it's over to you to consider what you think. Do you believe globalization is good? If so, I want you to argue that point and talk about why it's important. Or if you think globalization is not good, then again, we need you to be able to bring that into your discussion. So again, since the early 1990s, globalization has triggered a storm of controversy. Proponents consider market liberalization as being highly productive, raising living standards. So people that are for globalization, they believe that's a good thing. It can make companies more productive, it can raise living standards, and it encourages innovation across the globe. However, critics or people that are against globalization argue that it can help create inequalities, it can result in a loss of jobs, so jobs being transferred to low-cost countries. It can lead to what's called an environmental degradation, so a negative impact on the environment. and it's a declaration of war upon all culture. So the idea that globalization is resulting in the death of national culture. It's resulting in the death of how individual countries had their unique properties that are being eroded. But what happens next? So as an example here, so a rising tide of the global economy will create many economic winners, but it will not lift all boats. It will spark conflicts at home and abroad. Its evolution will be rocky, marked by chronic financial volatility and a widening economic divide. Those left behind will be stuck in a deepening economic stagnation, political stability and cultural alienation. They will foster political, ethnic, ideological and religious extremism, along with the violence that often accompanies it. Now, this is an excerpt taken from an unclassified report by the US Central Intelligence Agency, the CIA, in 1997. So I want to open the floor. I want to hear your views. Who believes that globalization has been a good thing and it's helped our world, or who believes that perhaps globalization has resulted in some of these things mentioned on the screen by the CIA report? So over to you guys. What do you think? I want to hear your views. Anyone?
Hello.
Hello there, yes.
Yeah, good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Yeah. What the CIA report said in 1997 is actually the consequences are things that we are seeing now. What we are seeing now is not different from what they've said in 1997, especially with the political instability and all the other factors. And when you look at the political instability in other countries, they all bound back to financial issues or economic issues. The youth, there's unemployment, and if they have jobs doing some of the things, they wouldn't do it. So all back to economic issue and economic stagnation in other countries. And you realize that that is what is happening now. Personally, myself, I think globalization, maybe we should have a second look, because full-scale globalization and other things will create wealth anyway, but some people will also be left out, and these are the people who also create problems for the wealthy people, the wealthy nations. Once there are some that are not wealthy and they are prepared to indulge in these activities, of course, the wealthy people will also not have peace. So I think it's high time we have a look again on wholesale globalization. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. That was a good point. So yes, unfortunately, some of the things mentioned in the CIA report from '97 have unfortunately been proven true, and there has been an element of what's the word I'm looking for, of extremism that has emerged as a result of globalization, which is a negative, of course. You know, in an ideal situation, we would be able to combat these types of behaviors, we'd be able to overcome them, be able to prevent them causing tragedy across the globe. But you're absolutely right. A lot of it does stem from political, social, and economic disadvantages. It stems from inequalities across the globe. People that have been perhaps suppressed, people that haven't perhaps had the opportunity to voice their opinion, to be able to make an impact in the world, have become disillusioned. That's not to justify their behaviour, of course. Their behaviour is completely incorrect. They shouldn't be acting in that way. However, you can understand that as a result of inequalities, these people have been pushed into a cycle, into a trap, whereby they feel that there is no other option but to take on violence or to take on extremism. So it is very, very dangerous. Globalization, it can have negative consequences. So that's a good point. Somebody else in the chat has just said it causes more problems that need to be thought through and dealt with. Absolutely. I mean, globalization is good for creating standardization. It's good for creating opportunities for jobs. It's good for creating awareness of how people around the globe, operate, how the cultures are very different. But by the same token, there's people that are using globalization for the wrong reasons, and that's where perhaps more needs to be done. The question is what that more is. I mean, who has the ability to control that? And we have, bodies such as the United Nations, we have the European Union here in Western Europe, for example. So there are international bodies. We've got NATO, we've got the World Health Organization. These bodies that exist to try and support countries where inequality is more rife. But unfortunately, we're still not seeing the same level of consistency in terms of how globalization works across the country. So, yep, thank you for those that took part. Appreciate your comments and your thoughts. It's always good to hear people's voices and hear what you're thinking too. So what's next? Well, globalization can also be an agent of change. So what do I mean by that? Well, fundamentally, globalization has altered the way in which the economic landscape works. Okay, the world itself is not the same as what it was 15, 20, 25, 30 years ago. A lot has changed, predominantly driven by changes in IT. IT has changed fundamentally how we work, how we communicate, how we go about our daily lives. But fundamentally, the economic landscape is changing. And that has profound implications for developing countries where perhaps people don't have access to the same resources, countries where the infrastructure is weak, they don't have correct phone signals, or they don't have the ability to stay connected to the internet, they don't have the ability to have a strong phone signal wherever they are in the country. So it can actually leave people behind, unfortunately. As much as technology has helped us in the developed world, in the Western world, or in the more richer world as we claim to be from, countries in the developing part of the world, they've been left behind, and that can also have problems that can cause further inequality for those people. It creates, however, wider markets for trade. Okay, so at the end of the day, options have increased. When you're looking to buy something, you're no longer restricted to your local city, to your town, to your country. You're now actually able to buy from the worldwide open market. Okay, you can access Amazon, which is available in a lot of the Western developed countries. You can access eBay. You can access Alibaba. So in Asia, Alibaba is a very big marketplace. So all these different marketplaces that exist online, they're willing to ship to pretty much anywhere in the world. So you've got access to a wider market. So that's as a consumer, but think about it from a business perspective. Businesses can now sell products using Amazon, using eBay, using Alibaba to lots of different countries. They're no longer restricted to the home market. You might own a business making products that don't maybe sell well in your country because the climate's different, the culture is different, there's not a need for the product in your home country, but there might be a demand for your product in a foreign market, and you can use a platform like Amazon, like Alibaba, to trade and sell products, sell goods and services to that other country. So it's opened up trade options for businesses across the globe. It's also allowed for an expanding array of tradables. So again, this isn't just looking at trading products and services, it's also about trading goods from a national level as well. So again, countries have what's called bilateral or multilateral trade agreements. So for example, wine and Australia. Australia sells wine to a lot of different foreign countries. Because Australia has a climate for wine. Same with California and the USA. They've got a lot of trade agreements whereby they reduce tariffs, they reduce taxes on these products because they want to encourage companies to sell. They want to encourage companies to generate GDP by selling these goods and services. So it's increased the array of trading or tradable products as a result. It's also resulted in larger capital inflows. So again, corporations such as Samsung, Apple, the likes of McDonald's or Coca-Cola, etc., they're investing in foreign countries. They're setting up factories. They're setting up stores. They're employing people. They're creating capital opportunities as they expand across the globe. So yes, they are looking to take advantage of perhaps, the access to the market, etc. So they are getting a return on their investment, but by the same token, they're also creating positive opportunities in the countries that they're expanding into. They're creating opportunities for employment, they're creating jobs, they're creating increased wealth coming into that country. So again, it creates opportunities. And finally, globalization has improved access to technology. So again, we could have the best smartphones in the world, but if there was no agreement on standard internet procedures or protocols, if there was no roaming on our mobile phones, then having all that technology would be pointless without the opportunity to take advantage of it on a global scale. So again, technology has been a big driver, but technology has also been helped by globalization. If, for example, say the UK decided that it no longer wanted to use 5G and it wanted to use private networks as opposed to open networks available to everyone, then that would have profound implications for how people living in the UK would connect to the internet. It would have profound implications for connectivity in terms of being able to communicate, being able to have access to the wider international market. Okay, so globalization has led to standardization in certain protocols, and it's also created opportunities for people like in the IT industry to take advantage of the technological advancements that are available. What about catalysts? So what is it that is creating demand for globalization? Well, firstly, customer expectations or consumer expectations. That's people like you and I. We want to have a good quality product or service. We want to be able to access as much as possible. When I'm looking to buy a mobile phone, yes, I've got my favorite brands. However, I want to be able to see what the different options are. I want to see if it's cheaper for me to buy it from the manufacturer or to buy it from a third-party website or buy it from a third-party supplier. So again, these are all expectations that I have. When I'm looking to buy something, I'm not necessarily going to buy it at the first place I come across. I might open up the internet. I might check to see if it's cheaper anywhere else. I might look to see if I can, what features are available on the product. I might look to read on reviews, what people said about the product. Again, that's all been made possible because of globalization. Now somebody sitting in Australia might write a review that I might read here in the UK, and I might think, okay, that's an interesting point. I didn't consider that, or that's an important point for what I want from this mobile phone. It doesn't seem to have this function or this facility. So again, globalization has made it easier for us to access information. And that leads me on to the next point, which is all about technological change. So advances in IT have allowed many companies to run their business in a way that was almost impossible 10, 15, 20 years ago. And today they can do that at a fraction of the price. Previously, they had to pay a lot of money to access technology-based advancements. Today, technology is almost fundamental. If you don't have technology, you don't have connectivity, then really your business isn't really set up to succeed. So technology and advancements in technology have helped drive globalization. Deregulation of markets. So something else that's improved is how the global market has become more accessible, particularly around how easy it is nowadays to operate on an international scale. Okay, so it's about making things more competitive. So, for example, say in the UK previously, now this isn't true, but say British Petroleum, BP, were the only oil supplier. They were the only company that supplied petrol and diesel. As a result of globalization, perhaps other companies have joined. You've now got Royal Dutch Shell, you've now got Jet Petrol, you've got all these different brands, Gazprom, you've got all these different oil suppliers that are now able to access the UK market. Now, BP, that's not true. There's been other brands in the UK for a long time, but in some cases that has helped, drive competition in a market. It's actually helped customers have more options, more ability to shop around and choose. Regional forces. So there are huge regional differences in the cost structure and growth rates in the world. So regional trade blocs such as the EU, NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Association, or ASEAN, the Asia and Southeast Asia network. They're all being formed, okay? These are all networks of countries that are coming together, and they are trying to create opportunities for one another. The rules of the game are changing. So what do I mean by that? Well, no longer are you competing only against companies in your country or in your market. You're now competing against companies on a global scale. You're competing against economies across the world. You're competing against businesses from any way, any shape of approach, okay? Just because you're a large department store doesn't mean that you're always going to be the number one choice. It might be a small niche SME that provides a better service, a better product. Customers can now access that because of the internet, because of technology, because of globalization. Fear and paranoia. So as a result of globalization, there is some sort of fear in the world that the world is becoming too homogenous. So the late Herbert Schiller, he was a prominent scholar in anthropology, was quoted in Tomlinson 1997. There's a paper on culture, and basically he said that the homogenized North Atlantic culture slope, and what the filmmaker Bernardo Bertolucci, with even more disdain, referred to as a dreadful American monoculture, is taking over the world. What do I mean by that? Well, as a result of globalization, these American brands are taking over. Coca-Cola, Nike, Starbucks, McDonald's, Disney, Apple. These are brands that are synonymous. If you go anywhere in this world, you will find people talking about these brands. They've become the go-to. They've become the big. They've become what people are aspiring to be. So Herbert Schiller said that's a concern because these American brands are taking over. They're becoming mainstream. They're perhaps replacing the subtle cultural differences that existed in the world. So that was something that came up. So the dominant cultural perspective on globalization today is the fear that globality will not bring unity, but merely uniformity. So what do you mean by that? Globalization isn't helping us become a more tightly connected society. It isn't helping us perhaps be united. It's actually helping us become uniform. So it's teaching us that there's certain ways to, certain foods to consume, there's certain products that are better than others. I mean, for example, I'm sure everyone on the call will agree with me. At some point, we've all aspired or wanted to own an Apple product, an Apple iPhone, an Apple iPod, an Apple iMac, a laptop, whether or not you've owned one, I don't know, but at some point we've all had that aspiration. So Schiller's argument is globalization has created this culture whereby we all want something because it's cool or because it's seen as being the in thing. For him, that's a bad thing about globalization. It's creating this narrative that certain brands are better, certain products are better, even if they're not price competitive. Okay. Monoculture and standardization. So again, the idea that one global culture, everyone's becoming the same. We all want to consume Coca-Cola products. We want to consume Starbucks coffee. We want to be seen eating at McDonald's. We want to be buying or accessing Disney products for our children. We want to be wearing Nike trainers. We want to be owning the latest iPhone. So this idea that we're becoming one international culture is becoming one monoculture. Again, that's not wholly true because we all have our different personalities, we have our different religions, we have our different beliefs. But the idea that we're all becoming homogenous in our consumption of goods and services is something that perhaps could be argued. Before we take a quick break, I want you to just think about this. So are we living in what we call the Herbert Schiller homogenized North Atlantic culture? What do you think? So obviously you can't raise your hand, but please come off mute and share your thoughts. Do you think these fears are justified? If so, why? If not, then why? What drives your view? What would make it better? So are we becoming the same? Are we becoming one big monoculture? Or do you think perhaps there is still scope for us to be saved. What do you reckon? I'll open the floor to your perspectives. Would you agree with Herbert Schiller that the homogenized North Atlantic or the American culture is taking over? How we've got to where we are? Well, globalization itself isn't necessarily a new phenomenon, and to be honest, up until the year 1913, trading in general was quite free across the globe. You know, the old spice route, for example, so spices were coming from the Far East, Asia, into Europe and Americas. There was silk as well, so stuff like silk and fabrics were coming from the Eastern Hemisphere. We had, for example, a slave trade. Now, again, not a positive reminder of history, but again, the idea that people were trading slaves, an example of trade, albeit something that wouldn't be looked upon favorably today. You know, we would no longer accept that as being socially acceptable in today's day and age. But again, the idea that people were able to trade, in that case, humans as commodities, it was all for free. There was no real borders or barriers preventing the transfer or the shipping of goods, services, commodities across the globe. So we very much had what's called capital movement, okay, and even movement of labour across countries is free. Nowadays, you have to apply for a work visa. You have to demonstrate why you fit the criteria, and you have to be sponsored. You have to, you know, there's certain loopholes, there's certain barriers and restrictions. Whereas previously, you could decide that you wanted to move to America, you wanted to move to Asia, you wanted to move to Middle East, Australia. You would just pack a bag and you would catch, at the time, mostly ships, but then aeroplanes became more common, and you didn't really have to worry about gaining the visas. You needed your passport, and you could fly to pretty much any country in the world and take advantage of the facilities that were there. So globalization isn't necessarily a new phenomenon. It's been around for a long time. It's just that in the past, we never had the same restrictions. Also, capital recognizes no geographical boundaries. So again, resources such as money, resources such as enterprise, they don't necessarily have borders. I mean, yes, we have different currencies, but currencies can easily be converted. You can easily convert into US dollars, you can convert into Hong Kong dollars, you can convert into Indian rupees, you can convert into all these different currencies. So capital or money doesn't necessarily have any boundaries. It's also an inherent feature of capital that it should seek to maximize profits. So again, in a capitalist form of enterprise, the idea is whatever you're doing, whatever reason you're running your business, the fundamental premise of it is it's all about making money. It's all about making ways in which your profit revenue can increase. So that's what the historical perspective on globalization has always been about. However, there's a couple of differences between what was the historical view and what we now see as globalization. Well, firstly, there are now universal restrictions on the cross-country movement. So as I was saying already, now if you want to go to another country to work, you need to apply for a work visa. You need to perhaps get sponsorship from a company. You have to demonstrate that you meet the skills criteria. You will not be prohibiting the rules, restrictions and legal frameworks in that country. There's also diverse types of restrictions, both on the movement of people, but also the movement of money and capital. And finally, the revolution in communication has made the world a sort of global village. What do you mean by that? Well, people can now communicate with one another a lot easily. People no longer have to worry about accessing media, accessing technology, accessing each other through traditional norms such as traveling manually. You can now do that without having to worry about any of that. Okay, you can now do that by picking up your phone and contacting perhaps friends, family, relatives, businesses, and whatever else you may have other parts of the world. So what about internationalization? Firstly, what is it? So defined by McDougall and Oviatt in the year 2000 as a combination of innovative, proactive and risk-seeking behavior that crosses national borders and is intended to create value in organizations. So internationalization is looking specifically at what businesses do. It's about exporting, it's about licensing, it's about having, for example, sales subsidiaries, having offices in another country. So internationalization is all about making your goods and services available in another country. So if we're talking about what businesses do, well, businesses don't globalize, businesses internationalize. Globalization is the effect of internationalization, but internationalization is the act of a business looking to expand beyond its domestic border. So how does the internationalization of the firm work? Well, firstly, the why and the how. So it's all about shaping the management and the organization of all aspects of how the company does business. What do I mean by that? Well, you have to be aware of how do you market in certain countries. Certain things that are culturally appropriate in the UK or in the US or in the Western world may or may not be culturally appropriate in other countries around the world. So for example, in Muslim countries, they don't believe in having adverts for alcohol. They don't believe in having adverts for pork products, for example. They believe that pigs are filthy animals. So again, marketing in the UK or in the US or in the Western part of Europe may all be about, you know, advertising alcohol, advertising certain wine brands, etc. You wouldn't see that in some Muslim countries because it's not seen as being culturally appropriate. So again, think about marketing, think about the branding of your product, think about sources of finance. Again, not all countries look favorably upon international investment. In some countries around the globe, you are not allowed to invest. For example, North Korea. North Korea is very shut off. They do not like people coming into their country and interfering with their system. Similarly, other countries in the Middle East, for example, the UAE, Qatar, it's almost impossible for you to gain a UAE passport or a Qatar passport unless you are physically born in that country. As far as they're concerned, you can come to work, you can get the work visa, you can stay in that country, but you will never ever be a UAE citizen. You cannot acquire a passport for the United Arab Emirates unless you are physically born in that country. So again, in that country, sometimes in order to acquire large finances, you need to show UAE residence, you need to show UAE citizenship. If you're not a citizen of that country, you can no longer acquire perhaps a level of capital. Why do they do that? Well, they want you to encourage you to invest alongside a domestic citizen. So again, if you're a large company, such as Apple, for example, and you decide you want to set up a new facility or a new warehouse in Dubai or in the UAE, and you want to borrow money to do that, well, you can't do that unless you have a UAE citizen with a UAE passport that can acquire access to that capital because he or she is a citizen of that country. You cannot do that. So what these companies tend to do is go into what's called partnerships. They'll work together with local citizens. They'll work together with people in the UAE, most likely the Sheikh and subsidiaries of the Sheikh in Dubai, Sheikh Mansour. That's how business is done in that part of the world. Whereas if you look at the UK, you wouldn't have that restriction. If you're a business looking to invest in the UK, as long as you can show that you have the necessary finance and you have necessary backing of your domestic economy, you're a sound person, you've got demonstrable business experience, you can come to the UK and you can invest in the United Kingdom. So what are some of the motivations for a business about wanting to go international? Well, firstly, it's all about increasing your profits and increasing your market share. All of a sudden, you're no longer restricted to your local country, your domestic market. If you're a UK company, you're no longer restricted to England, Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland. All of a sudden, the world is your oyster. You can now access countries in Europe, countries in North America, South America, Asia, Oceania, Africa. These are all places in the world that perhaps otherwise would not be available to you had you not went international. It also creates competitive pressure. So again, you might be competing against other companies. So how do you lower your prices? How do you become more attractive in that market? How do you avoid government regulation? So how do you localize in more flexible markets? For example, when it comes to stuff like chemicals and toxins, countries have certain rules and regulations on what chemicals and what products can and can't be sold. So you have to be flexible to be able to adapt to your products, adapt your policies, so that you meet the requirements of whatever country you're looking to move into. It also gives you excess production capacity. So again, there'll be things that are available to you by going international that might not be available in the UK or in your domestic country. Why? Because you've now got more of a market to sell to. You've got more of a market from which you can consume resources. You can consume certain raw materials that otherwise might not be available to you. Sometimes the domestic market might be saturated. What does that mean? Well, there might be too many companies already operating in your domestic market. Perhaps by going international, you can access a different market share, or you can access a market that is still quite young, that has not yet been discovered or has not yet been tapped into. Okay, and you can also take advantage of what we all know of as being lower costs, both in raw materials and manufacturing. The likes of Nike, Reebok, Disney, these are all big brands that have resorted to moving their manufacturing to places like the Far East, where it's cheaper, raw materials are easier to access, and labor is easier to access too. You're able to get access to labor without having to worry about costs. Technology advantage. So for example, Silicon Valley, if you are a tech startup or if you're a technology company, being in and around Silicon Valley in the US gives you certain advantages. You've got access to similar like-minded company, there's new innovations, there's people having similar conversations to you. Tax benefits, so people in the UK or people close to the UK, you might want to set up your business in the Isle of Man or Jersey. Why? Because they have a lower tax rate. So you won't be paying as much in corporation tax or income tax, so you can save money that way. You can have advantages of having sales office and distribution. So again, your warehouse might be in one particular place, but you can have a selling office in a different country. All of a sudden, you can take advantage of tax savings, because some countries will have different levels of tax. And as long as you have an office in that country, any profits or money made in that country can be served under the local tax rules of that particular country. So again, there's advantages that can be accrued by going international. So there's a few strategies for going international, and I've got a video here. Only thing is, it's 22 minutes long, so I don't think we'll have enough time for it. But what I will do is I will paste the link in the chat so you can all access the video in your own time. The reason I put it in is it's quite useful to demonstrate to you how internationalization can be achieved. How do companies set up facilities across the world? What are some of the intricacies involved in doing that? Okay, so I will post the link for you on the chat, and you can all access that in your own time if anyone is looking to view the video. Okay. Right, so that's the video available to you. But what does it do? Well, it also opens up all kinds of questions. Now, what kind of questions are we talking about? Well, firstly, the world's a very big place. There's many potential markets and many prospective countries that you might want to move into. How do you choose one? Where do you start? What are different options? Which foreign markets are the most attractive? You know, it's a critical issue, because if you're going to be investing in a foreign country, you don't have unlimited resources. Maybe you can only afford to invest in one or two countries. How do you choose the market that's going to be most attractive for you? How do you choose the market that's going to realize the most benefits, that's going to be able to give you the most profits? Should you consider entering a top country? By top, I mean, you know, country where that you know there's been a demand for your product, or a country where you know that the economy is doing well and people have got money to spend. So, you know, how would you recognize, how do you identify that? Would you select the largest potential market, or would you choose one that's easier to navigate? So again, potential market might be one where there doesn't exist any business similar to yours, and therefore you've got a big potential market share to gain. But similarly, that country might have a lot of what's called red tape or bureaucracy. Countries such as India, up until recently, countries such as the Middle Eastern countries, you know, Qatar, even the UAE, they've got very, very restrictive red tape barriers. If you're looking to invest, or even Russia, if you're looking to invest or set up business in those countries, you have to overcome a lot of barriers to get there. And finally, should you go into a developed market already? So, you know, should you go into a USA or an Australia, or you know, a country like UK, Germany, France? Or should you go to developing market? You know, should you try and go into Indonesia? Should you try and go into Brazil, countries where there's still potential growth opportunities? So again, these are potential issues or potential challenges that you face. So as a business owner, you've got a lot of decisions to make, and these decisions can't really be made for you. It's down to you to identify what would work best for your business. Someone's raised their hand. Yes, please feel free to come off mute and talk to me. Hello? Is it Ho Siu Sam? Do you have a question?
Yeah, yeah.
Hello, yes.
Yeah. Now, can you listen to me? Can you hear to me?
I can hear you, yes.
Oh, in my case, I will choose some country with a developed market because if a country become a developed market, maybe there's some pros in this country, including some political systems and laws and trust everything.
Yeah.
And just like China, with maybe China, a lot of people with is the largest potential market, but you know, the political system is not so good. The government control everything, even the balance your poverty. Maybe they would take by any time. Just he said is illegal, is unreasonable. Maybe
absolutely.
You would become nothing. You can do nothing.
Yep, that's an excellent point that you made there. Thank you for sharing your thoughts with us. Yes, perhaps going into a developed country where there's an existing infrastructure, there are laws, regulations, policies that encourage inward investment, encourage business activity, can be useful. And yes, coming back to your example on a country like China, the government plays a very important role in the economy. Unfortunately, that can sometimes deter investment. So we've seen recently the CCP in China have been cracking down on the big technology companies, the likes of Alibaba, Tencent. We've also seen them come down heavily on private tutor companies. They've also suffered, their share price has gone down significantly. So yes, absolutely, very, very good points there around the role of the government and how the government can influence business proceedings in a given country. So no, great, thank you for sharing your perspective there. So next up, we want to think about, well, before you go global or before you internationalize as a business, you need to identify which strategy you're going to adopt. And there's multiple, okay? Unfortunately, there's no one best route. It just depends on the nature of your business. It depends on how your business is organized, set up, and how you can perhaps realize the best benefits. So let's talk through some of these and understand how they might influence your decision. So firstly, foreign direct investment. Usually, regardless of what you end up doing, there will be some form of FDI involved. You'll have to invest money, capital into that country in order for you to operate. Depending on which method you choose, that can be a lot of foreign direct investment or it can be minimal foreign direct investment. But in some way, shape or form, you will have to invest in that economy, and that's known as FDI, okay? So it's foreign direct investment. In doing so, you might perhaps look to do what's called a merger and acquisition. So again, say you are a large corporation and you identify a small company in the country already. So for example, for argument's sake, let's say we're investing in India and there is a small company in India that does similar products or services to what we do. However, we're a large corporate business. We have economies of scale. We are more efficient. We have more money and capital available. We've got more access to raw materials, and therefore we're able to do the product for cheaper and we can do a better quality. So this, rather than setting up our own business, we may decide to purchase or acquire that small company in India. Why would we do that? Because that then gives us access to a ready-made business already operating in India that's very similar to our own, and then we can introduce our own product lines into that business. That's done quite often, even by the large corporations, likes of Google and Apple. They acquire almost 20 to 30 different businesses every single year. I think before the pandemic, Google recorded as having acquired almost 77, I think, different companies across the globe. Now, a lot of them were small startups, but Google recognized that there's potential in some of these companies. Google makes multi-million, if not billion dollars every year. So they've got the money to invest. So what they do is they acquire those companies and they bring them under their own umbrella. So that's one way of entering an international market. You may decide to contract. So you may decide that, okay, you've got the product, you've got the service, but you don't want to physically be present in that country. You don't want to set up your own office. You don't want to set up your own factory. You might contract that to someone else. So you might say to a company that already exists, okay, we will give you so much money, but on our behalf, you have to now sell this product. You have to manufacture it in your warehouse. You have to do what we want you to do in terms of selling to the market. That's a potential option. You can contract. You can franchise. A lot of the fast food outlets are franchised, okay? McDonald's, KFC, Subway, Domino's, Pizza Hut, a lot of them run as franchises. Joint ventures, that's when you decide to go in, not by yourself, but together with a partner. So again, you might choose to go into a 50-50 arrangement or a 60-40. You can do anything you wanted to really, but the idea is you share the risk with another company, ideally a company that's already operating in that market. So for example, Tesco is probably one of the biggest supermarkets in the UK. And in France, you have Carrefour. Carrefour may decide to work in the UK, but rather than setting up their own business, they might say to Tesco, why don't we set up a major or a mega store by the two of us combining? So Carrefour and Tesco might become a big super grocery chain. That's an example of a joint venture. You could decide to manufacture, so you can set up your own warehouse, you can set up your own manufacturing facility in that country. You could directly export. That means you don't do anything in that country other than sell products to that country directly. So exporting, okay. Unfortunately, with exporting, there come things such as taxes. There become things that can make your product more expensive, okay. It might be cheap for you to produce, but by the time you factor in the taxes, the time you factor in the cost of shipping, it can make your product uncompetitive in that market. So exporting sometimes can be an expensive option, and that's why companies sometimes try to avoid, depending on what it is they're exporting. And finally, indirect exporting. So what do I mean by that? Well, that's similar, but rather than exporting directly to that country, you directly export to somewhere else and then you export it again. So what does that mean? So for example, in the EU, it is free to move goods and services. So for example, if you're operating in France and you're selling to Italy, then there's no taxes on your product because they're both part of the EU. But Italy might also be part of another trade agreement with a country in Asia. Rather than me selling from France directly to Asia, it might be cheaper for me to export to Italy, not pay any taxes, and then from Italy to export to the country in Asia because they've got a favorable trade agreement. So I can actually save money that way. So that's known as indirect export. So rather than exporting directly to the country I want to sell in, I can do something that's called indirect export. Okay. Those are just some strategies. Again, I've got another video. Now this explains different entry modes and how they can be realized. Once again, in the interest of time, I'm not going to cover the video, but I will put the link in the chat. So please do feel free to watch this in your own time if you are so interested. So here comes the link. Chat, share. Finally, we have what are called key indicators. So to make our life a little bit easier, or to make our life simpler in terms of that decision that we look to make, we can do what's called key indicator analysis. So we collect and analyze data, both primary and secondary, that allow us to understand the trends in those countries. Usually you want to look at statistics for at least a 3-year period because they give you a picture of how the country is progressing, how the country is changing. Looking at it for a 1-year window is almost like a snapshot. It doesn't give you a real indication of how the country is performing, how the market is growing or shrinking. So you want to look at least 3 years worth of data, if not longer. So what types of data are available? Well, firstly, there are reports done by organizations, both independent and government organizations, that look at doing business abroad. So here in the UK, the gov.uk website, which is a government website, has information on how would you grow your business into a foreign country. So you can choose which country. You go on the website, you say you want to export to Indonesia, for example, and the gov.uk website has some advice, it has some indication of support, it has some indication of who you might want to speak to if you want to start exporting to Indonesia or any other country. The GEM reports, so these look at the markets specifically. So GEM reports are done, I think, by the World Health or the World Trade Organization, sorry, WTO, and they provide information on growing and emerging markets. And that's useful if you're looking to try and invest into the developing economies. The World Bank, again, the World Bank is an organization that exists to try and facilitate trade or try and facilitate internationalization. The Cia World Factbook, so again, we spoke about the CIA earlier, the Central Intelligence Agency from the USA. They have a fact book where they release information about doing business in different countries. You have the Index on Economic Freedom. That looks at how open the economy is, how easy it may be for you to do business. There's also Geert Hofstede's Cultural Dimensions. Now, Geert Hofstede passed away earlier on last year, but he was a very prominent anthropologist, and he looked at cultural dimensions. He did a study on IBM's International Computer Center, and he looked at people from different nationalities and different cultures and how they differed from one another. So he presented his research on the cultural dimensions of different countries. And finally, the National Trade Database. So again, each country will have this, but they will have details on how the country has agreements with different places in the world. So now that the UK, for example, has left the EU, the UK government is currently negotiating trade agreements with different countries, and these are available for businesses, these are available for consumers like you and I to be able to go on and view and understand what can be achieved. I would encourage you to maybe look at the country rankings and understand how the different cultural perspectives are realized. So again, there are different ways in which different countries do business, and by understanding some of these reports, by reading some of these reports, you can get a better understanding of how open a country is and how easy it may be or not be to do business in that firm or in that country, sorry. And that's really it for the lecture series, ladies and gentlemen. Here are some of the references used in today's lecture. Again, if you're looking to do any reading or if you're looking for sources of evidence, you may wish to consult some of these readings, some of these papers, some of these textbooks. So yeah, that is available to you as well. But really, what I want to take away from the entire lecture series is Doing business can have challenges. It's not a simple thing to do, just to set up a business and start selling. You have to abide by certain rules, certain frameworks, certain legal structures, depending on where you are. You have to think about demand and supply. How does the economy work? What is the role of the government? You have to think about international policies. It's not just simple as going online and starting selling to in a foreign market. You have to think about taxes. You have to think about logistics, delivery. You have to think about if you are going to grow your business abroad, how are you going to do that? Are you going to invest in the country? Are you going to do a joint venture, a merger or acquisition? So these are all valid things that a business needs to consider. And collectively, all of these contribute to what we call the business environment, okay? And that really is what this lecture series or this module is all about, understanding the business environment and how that shapes the decisions that we make. So I guess that's it from me. So I'll open the floor to see if anyone has any questions. So please do feel free to come off mute, or please do feel free to share any thoughts in the chat. Anyone at all? Any questions? Any questions about your assignment? Anyone not sure what they have to do in their assessment? No? You're all relatively happy? Okay. Well, if there's no questions, I will thank you very much for your time this afternoon, and I hope you took something useful away from today's lesson. And I look forward to receiving your assignments once they are completed. Thank you very much. Bye for now.